Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 21 preview guide, and we'll be looking at all the sort of positions, what kind of sort of key transfers you can make actually on this game week if you're sort of pressed for transfers. And of course, we're going to talk about, as part of the midfield position, Salah and Son replacements, and also, for example, strategies around both Salah and Son. Now, in terms of, let's say, generally speaking, for Game Week 21 news, unfortunately, this game week is going to last 2 weeks long. And so the information that we're going to get before the deadline is going to be pretty slim because, unfortunately, a lot of press conferences will actually happen after the deadline and we won't get crucial information on certain players. And unfortunately as well, the Burnley vs Luton game has been moved a little bit earlier. So it's now going to be on Friday night UK time, which means that the deadline is actually going to be effectively a day earlier. So do keep that in mind. Unfortunately, that just means less press conferences and less information that we're going to get. Before we actually get started with the transfers in terms of the midfielder position, I would actually really like to ask you guys to subscribe if you haven't already. If you're someone who's been watching the channel recently and enjoying the content, and you're part of the 50% of viewers who unfortunately still haven't subscribed yet, I'd really encourage you to subscribe. That would really help grow the channel. If you guys like the content so far or already subscribed, do feel free to like and comment. That continues to help the channel a lot. That continues to help the channel out a lot. Thank you guys so much once again, and let's get back to it. As far as this week in Game Week 21, let's quickly start off with the midfield position. I think you have two ways of going about, Salah and Son. First of all, it really depends on whether you have one free transfer or two free transfers. In general, I think most people have two free transfers because they're sort of planning for, let's say, a two-way transfer to get into Haaland. However, the news about Haaland is that we saw what Pep said before the Huddersfield game. He basically said that I think Doku and KDB are a little bit ahead of Haaland. But the thing about KDB, of course, is that because he's coming from a long-term injury, it's very unlikely that he's going to see crazy consistent minutes. Pep even gave an example within his own press conference saying we're not going to see something like 80, 90, 80 from Kevin De Bruyne. So I think that's interesting because if you're someone who's owning Foden or Alvarez, I think I'd still be happy about owning Game Week 21. And in terms of Foden versus Alvarez, another question, of course, is what positions can they take up in this team? Can they, for example, coexist with KDB and Haaland? Personally, for me, I think if, let's say, KDB and Haaland were definitely starting, in the future, let's say post Game Week 21, I think Foden's more likely going to have different positions in the pitch where he can actually fill in a spot. Whereas, for example, as you can see in the FA Cup game, as soon as KDB comes in, Alvarez is probably going to be out as well. And obviously, circumstances where Alvarez won't be playing centre forward if Haaland is there as well. So that's an interesting sort of piece of information. As far as actual transfers for Salah and Son, as I said, going back to the element of what strategies you can take, the one option that you can take is actually just transferring one of those players out in terms of taking out only one of Salah and only one of Son. Now, interestingly with Liverpool, because they actually beat Arsenal in the FA Cup, the impact isn't really conclusive right now, but it actually increases the probability that they will have a blank game week in Game Week 26. However, that also creates a smaller likelihood that they would actually have a double game week a little bit earlier than that. So double game week 25 with Liverpool versus Luton, that game being rescheduled 1 week earlier, giving Liverpool a double, then a subsequent blank. Another impact, though, is that Liverpool are most likely going to also blank on Game Week 29. So when you think about, let's say, owning a Liverpool player, think about, let's say, Salah, right? If Salah, let's say, blanks for 2 out of the game weeks that you're actually going to bring him back or keep him for after AFCON, then he's probably not that valuable as a pick. With Son, one of the issues that he runs with is that with Tottenham, you do have a potential blank game week versus Chelsea in Game Week 26. And so that's going to have an impact too. Personally, I think if I was actually to keep one of them, I'd probably actually keep Son, even though there is a smaller likelihood that, of course, Salah will actually get knocked out of the AFCON a bit earlier and therefore come back to FPL as a playing player sooner. Now, the second impact that I think is most interesting is that most likely all managers will actually go out of both Salah and Son. And you do need to plan for a landscape where we don't actually go into both Salah and Son back. Personally, my mind is to think that I probably would be going without Salah for a while. I know that sounds crazy. We've seen crazy hauls from him lately. We've seen Salah basically return back to, what is the glory days of FPL when he's there as a captaincy option. But in reality, I think with those sort of probable blanks, it might be the case that we don't actually own Salah until, let's say, after Game Week 29. And it also depends on, of course, what your wildcard strategy is, right? Some people are going to save their wildcard for something like Game Week 31. However, some people might actually be interested in wildcarding, to sort of play a dead end around 25 and 26, depending on what the outcome of those double game weeks are, and therefore play a strategy around that. So do think about that when you plan your Game Week 21 transfer. As far as the actual direct replacements for Salah and Son, I think my initial preference would have been Bowen. But the biggest news about Bowen in the FA Cup was that he actually came off injured after full time. And so we need to see what the impact is on Bowen. I think that the injury is probably not substantial. It doesn't seem like it was so bad an injury that he needed to be stretchered off. However, he only has 2 weeks to rest, and you're not going to get a press conference from Moyes before the Game Week 21 deadline. So we do need to probably exercise a bit of caution with Bowen. If you still like Bowen as your top transfer option, I would just wait until the deadline, hope to get some news, hope to see him and maybe some shots of, let's say, West Ham in training. And that could be your best bet to saying that Bowen's fit and ready to play for Game Week 21, which is, I think, still quite likely at this point in time. But it is a bit of guesswork on my part. As far as the next best transfer, I actually think it's actually going to be Pascal Gross or Phil Foden. Now, for me, Pascal Gross and Phil Foden are almost different examples, right? Gross is someone for me who doesn't really have blanks on the radar, doesn't really have doubles on the radar. Foden is interesting because he actually does have a pretty high chance of having a double Game Week 25 versus Brentford. And so, depending on what the probability is that you have in your mind of that double game week, Foden for me is still the more interesting option. As I said, I think he's the option who's probably going to keep more minutes over Alvarez, even if KDB and Haaland are back. And we know that even with KDB being back, that his minutes will be managed. And so in a fixture run where, let's say, even Man City were to have a double game week, Foden, I think, is quite an appealing option. And on top of that, too, what you're looking at with Foden is, of course, he is in a bit of form, right? The reality is his underlying stats so far this season have actually been quite good. And so this is a good time to really own Foden as a pick, because it seems like he's actually sort of turned a corner in the team. The biggest thing, of course, we know from sort of watching and playing FPL really over the years is that Pep can really sort of change his opinions on his team, but also he also has different opinions on how a certain game is going. And he's more than capable and more than prepared with, let's say, KDB being back to make changes for the team such that, for example, even though Foden is in such good form, that he can still, for example, sit 25 minutes or even be on the bench one of those games. And that's really how deep the sort of City team is right now. And so that's the risk that you run with Foden. With Gross, of course, I think it's a different situation where ultimately, with, let's say, the Brighton team is fully fit, you're not going to really see him playing as the 10 of the team. He's more than likely going to continue playing as a centre mid. But the beauty of Gross, of course, he can play full back. He can play even wing positions at times, play central positions too, attacking or slightly more, box to box. And that can have a huge impact on his output. But in reality, actually, he's shown to be a very, very stable player under De Zerbi. And you can see it with his underlying stats too. In fact, he has better underlying stats than some of the other key creators within the league, right? Players like Odegaard, players like Bruno actually have worse, for example, non-penalty expected goals compared to Pascal Gross. And of course, both Bruno and Odegaard are potential pen takers, right? Bruno, of course, basically a confirmed pen taker until he gives ones away to Rashford. Odegaard, I think you would say it's probably more attributed towards Saka, but he can still take penalties at times. So that's the interesting sort of point of view right now. I think I personally think Gross is probably the option that I would go with if I was actually trying to save a bit of money. Bowen for me would still be the top option. And as I said, for me, for someone who likes a little bit of risk, who trusts in, for example, Phil Foden's minutes, I would go with Foden. The other options, of course, are going to be other players like Jota or Eze. Personally, I think with Jota, I think he's a little bit too short term. And the same thing with Richarlison too. So these two options in terms of Jota or Richarlison, I'll discuss why I don't necessarily love them so much as a transfer option. Personally, I think we have a couple gambles within our teams. Jota is one of those where, particularly when Salah comes back, he's probably not going to have crazy good minutes. And so the value of a pick like Jota, particularly if you know that Liverpool will have future blanks as well, means that I think he's a very, very short-term option on top of that. As far as, let's say, someone like Richarlison, the issue, of course, with Werner is that he pretty much falls into a similar situation, right? With Timo Werner coming in, he's probably going to play left wing, in my opinion, when, for example, Son is at the Asian Cup. And so even though Richarlison's minutes are probably going to be guaranteed for, let's say, game weeks 21 to maybe 23, the issue, of course, is that other players will come back into the team. Maddison will come back as well. And therefore, you have Richarlison back into a landscape where he's only, for example, expected to play 65 minutes. There are capable substitutes for him, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very tricky landscape to own Richarlison. I think he's also too short-term as a punt. That's why I'm sort of advocating that we also move into one player who's at least going to be permanent. Now, you can have two transfers, right? That's the reality. You can pick two players to replace Salah and Son both with. And so my only sort of logic, I would say, is go with one short-term punt potentially, but also make sure that you actually have one player who's actually a long-term option that you can see yourself keeping, for the foreseeable future. The biggest thing about Gross as well is if you look at his fixture run, it's very good. But after that, even though he might not have amazing fixtures after 6 to 7 game weeks, the reality is he's still going to be more than likely an 80 to 90 minute sort of expected minutes player, which is very good for your team. It means that you have less issues to deal with when that sort of time comes around in FPL. As far as the actual other positions in the game, I understand a lot of people will be actually thinking about still fielding some transfers. Biggest thing is, of course, could be defense. Right now, I think because we know that Man City might have a double gaming probability, Walker, of course, is going to be one of those defender picks on the radar. But in general, it's not like City actually have a good game in Game Week 21, where I would say from the defensive point of view, it's going to be beneficial, right? Even though Newcastle have been horrible, they've been specifically horrible on defense as opposed to being, truly negligent on attack. If anything, they actually still look like a competent attacking team, but have completely dropped off the map on defense. So owning a City defender is not something I would like to do this week necessarily. I'd rather go into someone like Purpose Estupiñán. For the same reason that Gross is good, I think Estupiñán's going to benefit as well. Now, there was also news that Valentin Barco, an Argentine player, is actually going to join this Brighton team. But I think that the biggest thing with Barco is that he could also play winger positions, right? We know that they lack a bit of depth in the wing positions. Adingra had to cover a lot of minutes in both left wing and right wing recently. It would make more sense, in my opinion, for Barco to actually take, for example, a sort of midfield-like position. We've also seen that I think Estupiñán, when available, has pretty much played good minutes unless he's injured. So I would really not be too worried about that. I think Estupiñán is still an amazing option to go with. And part of that, of course, is we know that Brighton aren't exactly a brilliant defensive team, but that is sort of put aside, or can be put aside, when you have someone who is as attacking as Estupiñán. So that is what the value is in terms of the defensive transfers this week. If you're looking for alternative defensive transfers, I probably wouldn't be looking at, for example, Porro immediately. I just think when you compare, let's say, Estupiñán to Porro, biggest thing, of course, is that, yes, of course, the Spurs team is going to be upgraded by, let's say, Van de Ven coming back. But I think one thing that Porro does benefit from, and recently has benefited from truly, is Maddison, for example, being out of the team. Maddison actually seems to be capable of joining back to the team and maybe even playing minutes as soon as Game Week 22. So I think that sort of drops the value of Porro a little bit. I would side with probably Estupiñán now if I was actually to make a transfer and you don't already own one of those two players. As far as the forward position, once again, even though this isn't a perfect fixture for Solanke, I still think that he is the go-to sort of default transfer option. And part of that is because we know that the Bournemouth vs Luton game is going to be rescheduled sometime soon. So I think Solanke, for example, would still be a good transfer option if you're looking for a forward this week. The reality is that when you're looking at the forward position, you're sort of waiting for Erling Haaland news. In my opinion, even if we might not get consistent or good Erling Haaland news, I don't really see him playing good minutes in Game Week 21, right? KDB featured a little bit versus Huddersfield. Haaland wasn't even in the squad. So I really find it a little bit absurd to say that Haaland's going to immediately step onto the field versus Newcastle and start. If anything, I think he's going to be a late substitute. And maybe, once again, Man City might not risk Haaland. So this is the situation. A lot of people, I think, have been a little bit overconfident in terms of his injury. We've seen that it actually is a very serious injury, and Man City have treated it as such as well. So I don't think there's any need whatsoever to sort of look at Erling Haaland as an option that you need to go to in Game Week 21. If anything, what I would do is probably save, if you're on 2 free transfers this week, maybe make one midfield transfer, take one of Salah or Son out, replace him with a certain player, then think about rolling your second free transfer and bringing back Erling Haaland instead, maybe on Game Week 22 if the news is positive. Because keep in mind, of course, Game Week 21 and Game Week 22 are not, for example, fixtures that are right next to each other, right? You have a little bit more lag and a little bit more time for Erling Haaland to come back to full fitness. And I think on Game Week 22, because that fixture is really, really good as well, even if Haaland was not to play 90 minutes, but he was guaranteed to start, for example, and play 60 minutes, that's still a good enough transfer to bring Haaland in. So that for me is the landscape for Game Week 21 in terms of FPL. In terms of the FA Cup, as I said, we will find out information in terms of the 4th round draw and the impacts on that in terms of fixture probabilities in Game Week 29. What I would do, of course, is continue to follow Ben Krillin on Twitter or social media platform X to get as much information as possible on the double game weeks and blank game weeks so you can plan around that. If you, for example, are already thinking about free hit strategies or wildcard strategies, and that involves, for example, teams like Liverpool or teams like Man City, then that's actually the best thing to think about too. Like, how will that influence your plans and your transfers in the future, and how will you sort of change your mind in terms of booking your transfers from Game Week 21 to, let's say, Game Week 25, for example, where we think that it might be potentially our first double game week for the season for a relevant FPL team outside of Luton, right? So this is the landscape so far. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys really enjoyed the content over the break. I know, unfortunately, lack of football is a bit dull, but fortunately, we're getting a little bit more news week on week with, let's say, probabilities with FA Cups and things like that, and we can continue to sort of get a bit more information. And then for me, what I will do is wait until as close until possible for the deadline, wait for the 4th round draw, and then the cheat sheet will come out, and we'll hopefully have the team selection as well before the Gaming 21 deadline. So thank you guys so much for watching and supporting the content in 2023. Really enjoying making content 2024 and hoping for the channel to continue growing. Thank you guys once again, as I said, and I'll see you guys next video.